I want to welcome everybody here today. This has been, this partnership with Robbie Jones and PRRI has been a great joy for us here at Brookings. I'm E.J. Dion. Our partnership is in our 8th year, and I am happy to say that polling partnerships are not term limited. So I hope that we can continue with this work. My colleague Bill Galston will formally welcome our friends Joy Reid and Henry Olson. They have been partners with us now for many years and always give the best analysis of Robbie's numbers and kick off a really good conversation. Just so you know how we're going to go, Robbie will do one of his patented PowerPoints where he will explain all these numbers to you very clearly. And then Bill will come up and introduce Henry and Joy. They're going to have a response to the poll. We're going to do some Q&A and crosstalk up here, and then we are going to bring you all into the conversation. Robbie, as many of you know, is the CEO of PRRI and a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He is the author of many books, including The End of White Christian America, a fascinating book that came out last year, now out in paperback. If you have not seen it yet, you really should take a look at it. He writes a column for The Atlantic on politics and culture, appears regularly in a Faith by the Numbers segment on Interfaith Voices. He has been featured in just about every national media you can think of. He has got a PhD in religion from Emory University, where he specialized in the sociology of religion. He also holds an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and, so you can trust his numbers, a bachelor's degree in mathematics and computing science from Mississippi College. He is the founder of PRRI, and he also was an assistant professor of religious studies at Missouri State University. But as those of you who have not experienced it before, he is one of the best PowerPoint artists in the country, and I wish I had those skills. It's a real joy to welcome our friend Robbie Jones. Thank you, Robbie.
Well, welcome everyone. I am really pleased that to be here for the 8th year in a row. It has been quite a while, and I see a number of faces. Has anyone been here for all of them? I see a lot of actual familiar faces up here. Well, thank you for coming, and we also have a webcast audience who's joining us. So welcome to all of you who are joining us via live webcast. I just want to say, before I jump in, a big thanks to the PRRI team. These big surveys and reports are always a team effort. And I want to say a shout out to my co-authors, Dan and Alex and Molly, and also for the rest of the PRRI team helping with editorial, logistical, and everything under the sun to get us here today, to Carolyn and Sheridan and to Ariel as well. So thanks to the PRRI team here. Well, let's jump in. So we're going to take a look out sort of 1 year in and 1 year out from the midterms. So looking back and looking ahead a little bit, like where are we? And I think focusing a lot on trying to understand what's going on, if anything unusual, with the Republican coalition under Trump 1 year in. So you'll see a lot of different ways we'll be slicing and dicing the data, particularly looking at fissures inside the Republican Party, or no fissures, as the case is in some ways. But hopefully we'll come away with a better sense of where the country is on some major issues, and also in particular where the Republican coalition is at this point in time, as I said, looking back and looking ahead as well. If any of you are tweeting today, we do have a hashtag. It's AVS 2017, so feel free to use that if you're tweeting along with us. Okay, so I'm going to start with job performance. There's been a lot of press out there about President Trump's historically low job performance. We are also finding it at historically low levels. Among all Americans, we're at 41% approve. 22 percentage points of that is strongly approve, and then we are looking at about 6 and 10 disapprove, with 42% strongly disapproving in the general public here. If you look, not surprisingly, there are big partisan differences on this front. And one thing to say is that President Trump, among Republicans, self-identified Republicans, is doing quite well. So 84% overall saying they approve of his job performance, only 13% saying they disapprove. Independents look like the country as a whole, but there are Democrats, right? 72% strongly disapprove, not just disapprove, but strongly disapprove, with an additional 13% disapproving, only 12% approving of President Trump's job performance level. So quite a partisan split. So we're going to take a little bit of a different dive here. So here's the same numbers from before, 41% support, but looking at the gender divides on Trump job approval here. Men are basically divided on this kind of men overall. This is in the entire country. About the same number approve and disapprove, but there is notably this big 49% block of women who not only disapprove but strongly disapprove of President Trump's job performance. Only about a third of women approving of his job performance at this point in his presidency. So we try to take also another way of looking at this, a kind of deeper dive, and we asked a follow-up question of everyone who said that they favored President Trump's job approval. We asked a follow-up question, said, okay, great, so you've told us you favor him. Is there anything he could do to lose your support, right? To kind of get a sense of just how tight the support was. And for those who said they did not approve, we asked the same question also, is there anything he could do to gain your support on the other side, to get a sense of just how dug in these opinions were. So this is kind of the typology here, strong supporter of those who favor and say there's virtually nothing President Trump could do to lose their support, and then all the way down on the other side, we're labeling strong opponents, those who oppose Trump or don't favor his job performance and say it's impossible, virtually impossible for him to gain their support. So here's what the lay of the land looks like. So basically there's that 41% job approval, but when you break it down this way, there's 15% of the country who say they not only favor him, but there's virtually nothing he could do to lose their support. That's that 15-point anchor. And then all the way on the other side, what you can see is that there's a pretty solid group in the country, 33%, who say they don't favor his performance. There's virtually nothing he could do to gain their support. So the people dug in on both sides. It's 2-to-1 on the opposition side, right, in terms of intensity here, which is notable, I think. So when we look at this and break it out, I'm going to do 2 slides here. So who are Trump's strongest supporters using that same scale about favorability and those who say there's nothing he could do to gain or lose his support. This is what it looks like. So these are Trump's strongest supporters here. Among Republicans, you can see there's that 84% approval rating, and about a third, 34%, saying there's nothing virtually nothing he could do to lose their support. White evangelical Protestants, been a lot in the news here, especially with the Roy Moore candidacy down in Alabama, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. But 72% approving of President Trump's job performance so far, but 3 in 10 saying there's virtually nothing he could do to lose their support. So about 3 in 10 really locked in. Whites with no college degree or white working class Americans, just barely over the 50% mark at 55%. Here, about a quarter of them saying there's nothing he could do, and there's white men at the bottom. But if I put the other side up, you can kind of see how it falls out. I do want to point out among white working class Americans here, this 24% on each end, right? So that's notable, I think, that this kind of next to the last column here. Quarter say there's virtually approve and virtually nothing he could do to lose their support. On the other side, about a quarter saying they disapprove and there's virtually nothing he could do to gain their support. So this kind of, leaning a little bit more toward support, but there is this kind of intensity parity on either side. Here's the other side of this equation. So those who are Trump's strongest opponents, and you can sort of see here's the approved side among groups that are least likely to support him. And yes, that is a 0 hiding behind the axis there among African Americans on that side. But among Democrats, so it's 1 in 10, but only 2% saying they're really approving him at that level. But here's the real story if you look at the other side, right? So all the green is disapproval, and the dark green are groups who not only disapprove, but say there's virtually nothing Trump could do to gain their support, right? So among African Americans, 6 in 10 African Americans not only disapprove, but say there's virtually nothing he could do to gain their support. So really locked in groups. Latinos much more mixed than African Americans here. We'll see this in some other slides as well. But the other groups, religiously unaffiliated, strongly also, and women about 4 in 10 women not only disapprove, but say there's virtually nothing he could do to gain their support. So that's just kind of the story on job approval. But let me kind of go through a few other political challenges here, and some of these are looking ahead. So right now and looking ahead. So this is a question we've asked 3 times across the year. Based on what you've read or heard, do you believe that President Donald Trump should be impeached and removed from office, or don't you feel that way? When we asked right after the election, it was about 3 in 10 who said, in February, who said they supported impeachment. That number jumped up to 4 in 10 in August, the next time we've asked it, but it's remained steady since we asked it in August, and this has been fairly stable. But again, here you can see there's a fairly large gender gap, with men about 2 to 1 saying that they would oppose impeachment, and women evenly divided on the question, right? So there's a really big, gender gap on this particular question. So looking ahead to 2018, one of the things we find here is a distinct Democratic advantage. It's not a landslide, but it is a 7-point Democratic advantage when we ask people to anticipate how they would vote for either the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate in their election district in the midterm elections. Again, here, fairly big gender gap going on here, 51-31. So it's a 20-point gap among female registered voters here, with basically half of them, more than half of them say they prefer the Democratic candidate, only about 3 in 10 saying that they prefer the Republican candidate in their district. 2020, so we look ahead to 2020. Here's what we see, and this is looking at among Republicans here now, saying whether they would prefer Trump to be the nominee or would prefer someone else. I do think it's notable that we basically have 3 in 10 Republicans saying they prefer another nominee in 2020 at this point in the presidency. It's 2 to 1 the other way, but there's 3 in 10. And if we look at kind of strong Republicans and weak Republicans, and these are people who kind of self-identify as a strong Republican or weak Republican, you can really see that really who Trump has more in his corner are people who are strong partisans, right? People who are strongly identify with the Republican Party. So it's not kind of outliers to the Republican Party, but strong people who strongly identify with the party. And among weak Republicans, there's actually a plurality the other way, nearly half wishing there was a different candidate. Here are white evangelical Protestant Republicans, and you'll see there it's 7 in 10, squarely in President Trump's corner, only about a quarter saying they prefer a different candidate. And then this is kind of all other Republicans, so this is kind of a binary break. Those who are white evangelical Protestants and everyone else, essentially 56% of non-white evangelical Republicans saying that they wish for Trump, and then 37% saying they wish for a different candidate. So to that question about who's still in his corner, clearly white evangelical Protestants still strongly in the president's corner. We also took a look at just perceptions of the party, and especially with the midterms coming up, what kind of party loyalty is it? And in particular, what this political science literature has suggested for a while now is that the story here is less about who loves their own party and more about who hates the other party, right? That's typically how it runs. So we try to get underneath this a little bit and get a sense of it. So we asked this question, a 3-part question. Do you feel like the policies of the following group, and we gave people 3 options. Are they moving the country in the right direction? Are they somewhat misguided but not dangerous? Or are they so misguided that they pose a serious threat to the country? All right, so kind of giving people these 3. And so what I'm going to show you is what Republicans think about Democrats and what Democrats think about Republicans here. All right, so I'm going to give you the first category first. Here are all the Republicans who think the Democrats are moving the country in the right direction, and all the Democrats who think the Republicans are moving the country in the right direction. Right? That's it. 5. So you can see where this is going, I think. So here's the middle category, are somewhat misguided but not dangerous. All right? And here's the last category, so misguided they pose a fundamental threat to the country. So majority territory, almost mirror images of each other, pretty perfect negative partisanship in the country today. So I think taking this in kind of helps explain a lot when we're puzzling over particular candidates and the party, I think in particular. We can come back to that. But this is where we stand. There's a couple of the ways we can break this out that illuminates. We also asked this question not only about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but about President Trump's policies itself, so we could compare the Republican Party versus the Trump administration itself. And this one is among all Americans. So what's notable here is that among all Americans, the parties fare about equally well, right? If you just, and it kind of goes to the divided nature of the country. But if we look among all Americans just at President Trump, nearly half of the country, 46%, say that they see a distinct difference between the Republican Party and President Trump, and see Trump's policies as a particular danger to the country itself. However, if you look at inside of Republicans, so this next slide I want to show you is the same data, but among Republicans, basically what they think about their own party and Trump, right? So this is among Republicans, what they think about their own party and Trump. And, noticeably, about a majority of them say that the Republican Party's policies are moving the country in the right direction, but about a third say they're misguided, and 7% say they pose a threat to the country. But here's what's notable in kind of to our bigger question about kind of Trump and the Republican Party, that more Republicans think that Trump is moving the country in the right direction than think the Republican Party is moving the country in the right direction, right? So, and it's notable, 67%, nearly two-thirds of Republicans say Trump's policies are moving the country in the right direction, 55% of Republicans. So that, I think, is also notable just in terms of where Trump's strengths are inside of self-identified Republicans on, rank and file Republicans on the ground. Here is what Democrats think about Republicans and Trump as well. So 54%, that's the slide we saw a second ago. But here's the Democrats' impressions of President Trump, seeing a clear difference, about 20 points, more likely to say that President Trump's policies are misguided and pose a serious threat to the country. All right, so one more round on is the GOP the party of Trump here. We also took another look at this, kind of another swing at it, in looking at whether people supported Trump as their preferred primary candidate in 2016 and whether they wanted him to be the 2020 nominee again. And so using those two questions, we basically came up with people who he was both their preferred candidate in 2018 and 2016, and they like to see him at the top of the ticket in 2020. The exact opposite, on the other hand, that he was not their preferred candidate in 2016, nor do they want them to see him in 2020. And then the mixed groups who were with him but now say they'd like to see someone else, and then the people who were not with him but are now with him. Right, so we kind of got people moving away here. And this is what the lay of the land looks like here. And this is among all Republicans and Republican-leaning independents. So we kind of group everyone who leans Republican and self-identified as a Republican for this analysis. But basically, you see this first point is 18% is basically we've labeled never Trump. Like he was not their preferred candidate in 2016. He's also not their they wish there was someone else in 2020. Notably, this is where the predominant category where Mormon Republicans reside. Notably, so about 1 in 10, 11% of that category is made up of Mormons, which is a sizable number given the small size of Mormons in the country as a whole. So that's one thing to say about that category. The next category here is the leaning away from Trump. About 23% of the country is leaning away from Trump. The one thing I'll point out here is that this is the category that has the most non-white Republicans in it, right? So people who are African American, Latino, or mixed race. And what this, one thing that we can see from that is that these are people who he was their preferred candidate in 2016 and are now leaning away from him, saying he's not their candidate. So inside of this kind of Republican and leaning Republican group, one thing we can say is that disproportionately non-white Republicans are moving away from Trump based on these two questions. Then there's about similar number who weren't with him but are now leaning toward him, 19%, and then this 40% over here were with him before and are with him again. So that's kind of the lay of the land. To give you a sense of how this plays out on a couple of questions, and to give you, I think, just a sense of the attitudinal differences among particularly the poll ends here. Here's a couple of Trump signature issues. Temporarily preventing people from some majority Muslim countries from entering the U.S. That's in the news today. Building a wall along the U.S. border with Mexico. So these two numbers are where all Republicans and Republican-leaning independents are. So a little more than 6 in 10 support among all Republicans. But if we look at the Never Trump group, there's a little bit of fall off on the kind of Muslim travel ban number here, but a fairly big difference on the idea of building a wall with Mexico. Those in the Never Trump camp really not on board with that. But look at what happens if we compare the Always Trump, people who had been with Trump sort of both in 2016 and favoring him in 2020. You can see these really big differences between these kind of factions inside the Republican Party, in particular on this idea of building a wall with Mexico. That's a 50-point gap between the kind of Never Trump category and the Always Trump category on the end. One more look here is the negative partisanship numbers that we looked at just a minute ago. These are the same numbers that we looked at a second ago, but here we see, sir, if we look at the Never Trump and the leaning away from Trump folks, neither one of them, if you look at the orange bars, neither one of them are in majority territory, saying that the Democratic Party is so misguided, right, that it poses a threat to the country. But if we look at folks who are either leaning toward Trump now or were always with Trump, you see the kind of negative partisanship really jump, right? So this 54% of those leaning toward Trump, and more than 6 in 10, 62% of those in the Always Trump camp saying that the Democratic Party poses a fundamental threat to the country. So just much more strongly on this negative partisanship measures. And then this last one I'll do before I want to give you a smattering of issues, kind of current issues before we wrap up. But this last one here is a question we've asked kind of across the last year about some things that we heard actually in some focus groups that because things have gotten so far off track, we need a leader who's willing to break the rules in order to set things right is the end of that question. And here are the number of people who agree among Republicans and Republican-leaning independents. So 55% of them agree, Republicans and leaners agree with that statement. But in the Never Trump camp, only 35% agree that this kind of authoritarian leader is the kind we need. Those who have moved one way or the other are kind of divided on the question. But here's the number for those sort of all in the Always Trump category, sort of highly sort of agreeing with this statement at about 2/3 agreeing with this statement that we need a leader who's willing to break the rules if that's what it takes in order to set things right. Okay, so I'm going to wrap here with some selected current issues, some things that are where we're really divided, and I promise I'm going to leave at the end with at least one place where we agree. All right, so most Americans, this question about athletes kneeling at football games, right, has become something of a political football, no pun intended. So here is where all Americans are. It turns out that all Americans, 55%, actually agree that professional athletes should be required to stand during the national anthem at sporting events. Whites and Latinos are here in agreement, but look at African Americans on the issue, right? 3/4 of African Americans disagree with that statement. And not surprisingly, probably, the partisan divides are just huge on this. 86% of Republicans agreeing with this statement, 2/3 of Democrats disagreeing with this statement. So that's kind of where we are with that issue. The media. Do you think most reporters have a personal or political agenda, or are most reporters trying to report the news fairly and accurately? We'll have Joy up here in a minute. Put the spotlight on her. But here's where we are. Most of the country, 53%, says that that reporters have a personal and political agenda. 43% saying they're trying to report the news accurately. But it is just, again, a kind of partisan divide on this question. 8 in 10 Republicans saying reporters have a personal and political agenda. 2/3 of Democrats disagreeing, saying that most reporters are trying to report the news accurately. So this kind of partisan lens, even on the media here. Then on some of Trump, in particular, Trump's signature immigration issues, here we can see. So here's where the country is. And I do want to pause here to kind of just take this in. So here's 3 policies, temporarily preventing people from some majority Muslim countries from entering the U.S., passing a law to prevent refugees from entering the U.S., and building a wall along the U.S. border with Mexico. I do want to point out that for neither one of these policies does support in the general population exceed 40%, right? So that's kind of where the country is as a whole. But I want to put up the partisan divides, and you can see why I think this has become kind of a fight. So there's Republican support, self-identified Republican support for each of these 3 issues. It's 56% here passing a law to prevent refugees, so less support for that, but kind of very strong support for the kind of Muslim travel ban and building a wall. And independents and Democrats looking kind of much, much different from and this is in some ways what political scientists often call asymmetrical polarization, right? We have kind of one party out in one place, and then independents and Republicans more aligned on the other side of an issue. In particularly building a wall, you can just see this massive gap between Republicans and basically everyone else on this question. One thing I don't have a slide up here on that I will say on the immigration front is that we did find 72% support for the basic policies underlying Daca, and that is basically the question we have asked about whether people who are brought to the U.S. as children should be able to stay in the U.S. And get legal status if they go to college or serve in the military. We found 72% support for that, including 6 in 10 Republicans in support for that. So there's bipartisan support for that policy, although there's these divisions here. And I will, this one here, there is also fairly widespread agreement on this question of sexual harassment. And the way we ask this question about is basically whether stories about women being sexually harassed and assaulted in the workplace are isolated incidents, or are they part of a broader pattern of how women are treated. 7 in 10 Americans say it's part of a broader pattern. There is a gender gap, but it's not overwhelming, and most men are agreeing with women on this question that it's part of a broader pattern. There's also a partisan gap, but again, both parties essentially on the same side of this question. So on this question that's been kind of all over the news pretty much every day, we actually have bipartisan agreement and kind of agreement across the genders. So I will kind of wrap it up with that little moment of agreement, bipartisan and cross-gender agreement, and then we will see where else we want to go with the discussion with the rest of the panel. So thank you.